Hello everyone, I'm Jody, and today I'm going to present using image-to-text recognition technology to facilitate vocabulary acquisition in authentic context. And the research was conducted by three researchers: Rustam Shadif, who is at Nanjing Normal University in China; Qingting Wu, who is at National Yunnan University of Science and Technology in Taiwan; and Yueming Huang, who is in National Chenggang University in Taiwan. And this essay was published in Recall in 2020. So first of all, here's the outline. In this research, the literature review was included in introduction, and then followed by research motivation and questions, methods, results, discussion, and finally conclusion. Okay, so we all know that memorization of vocabulary has long been a common way for many learners to learn lexical items. However, it is more like rote learning, which means memory and habit rather than an understanding. So it does not lead to deep learning. Okay. In order to understand a word and remember it for a long time, we have to use the purpose of communication. For example, including the language input, which means a learner receives learning information; language output, a learner applies learned information through producing language output. Also, there is another thing called cognitive involvement. The learner should initiate learning and then actively search for helpful resources, and then apply newly learned knowledge in a new context. By doing so, the learners can have a better understanding of the vocabulary. Okay. And also, research a common vocabulary acquisition strategy is the use of pictures. And researchers have shown that vocabulary acquisition with both labels and pictures is beneficial and is more effective compared to vocabulary acquisition with labels only. That is because providing pictures enables various parts of the brain to operate simultaneously and thereby improves cognitive ability. So this notion is supported by dual coding theory. The theory suggests that visual and verbal information are processed in different parts of the brain, and the visual channel processes visual information and produces pictorial representations, while the verbal channel processes verbal information and produces verbal representations. And both visual and verbal information are selected and held in both visual and working memory. A learner then mentally builds connections that organize information into cause and effect chains. Finally, the visual model, verbal mental model, and prior knowledge are merged through constructing referential connection among them. And so, there is another theory called authentic learning, which suggests that learning is context related, so the importance of learning in a specific context should always be emphasized. Okay. And so authentic learning means that we have to make context and learning inseparable. And here are some core features of authentic learning. First of all, it provides authentic context that reflects the way the knowledge will be used by learners in real life, and it should provide real-world relevance of the authentic activities. And also, it should promote reflection and enable authentic learning assessment within the text. Okay, followed by another important thing called seamless learning. Seamless learning takes place when in-class and out-of-class learning experiences are linked, and learners should make the best use of learning resources that exist both inside and outside the classroom during the seamless learning process. Okay. And here are some previous studies that implied new technology in the language learning process. New technology can enable language learners to learn seamlessly. That is, the link classroom learning with learning in the real world. And here And in these studies, they shows that applying technology in research in learning process is beneficial. For example, they can improve vocabulary acquisition, and the audio input can help the participant recall the meaning of new words and reduce their cognitive load. And so, new technology is beneficial for vocabulary acquisition. Now let's look at motivation, research motivation, and questions. So, I would like to talk briefly about ITR tool. First, a learner took a picture of an object they were interested in, and the ITR tool simultaneously generates the word label in a target language. Because the ITR tool needs internet connection, so I use an earth here. Okay. So here's the research motivation. The researchers think that in earlier studies, most of the learning activities were designed based on an instructor-centered approach, so they designed ITR tool that is more learner-centered approach. And the research gap here is that ITR tool has not been previously described in any mobile-assisted language learning research. So that's why they want to do this research. Okay, and here are the 3 research questions. First one, do learners who study using ITR technology learn vocabulary better compared to those who study using traditional method? And how do learners perceive their learning experience using ITR technology? And the final one is, what are the affordances of ITR technology for vocabulary acquisition? Okay, so here's the method. First of all are the participants. So very special participant in the studies. There are 14 native speakers of Russian learning English as a foreign language from an elementary school. So you can see their age from 10 to 11. And okay. And all of them have 3 years of EFL learning experience, which means they are at the beginning levels, and they have 3 classes a week, each for an hour and for 2 weeks. So let's look at the learning procedure. First, they assigned the learners to a control group and experimental group. Each group have 20 students, and then they give the students a pre-test and explain the learning task. And as for the training period in the middle of the chart, it means the training period to teach them how to use ITR tools, to make them familiar with the tool for the following sections. And then they are given 6 EFL classes, and the control group complete the learning task using traditional way, and the experimental group use learning task by use the learning system. Oh, and finally, they were given post-test questionnaire and interviews, and the delayed post-test was taken after 2 weeks. 2 weeks later. So in class, they were told the vocabulary sentence patterns about shopping, and they were asked to practice their language by completing text exercises. And after class, they have to apply newly learned information to context, with a realistic simulation of the real world, and they have to describe their last shopping experience. So here are the difference between 2 groups. Experimental group took photos of target objects in the shop market, and then used ITR technology to create labels for the captured objects, and finally describe their shopping experience using ITR technology. And the second one, in the control group, they learn vocabulary and view the corresponding pictures in their textbooks and describe their shopping experience in their paper-based notebooks. And ITR technology was using tablet. The students used tablet to process the ITR technology. Okay, so here is the procedure of how ITR technology works. First, they took photos like a fruit, an apple, and had their labels generated in English. and then the learners created content in which they describe their shopping experiences by typing and inserting photos they had taken. And then they have the textbook. Okay, so actually I think it is a function of Google search, which is called search by image. You just upload a picture you took, and then Google will share everything about that. Okay, and here are the design of pre-test, post-test, and delayed post-test. So all of the tests have 3 questions, including select, match, and write. And for questionnaire survey, the researchers want to find out the learner's perception of the ITR technology. So they designed these 4 dimensions, including perceived ease of system use, the usefulness of the system during learning, and behavioral intention to use the system for learning in the future, and finally their satisfaction of this ITR tool. And finally, semi-structured interviews was conducted. They last for 20 minutes, and researchers would ask open-ended questions to the participants. Okay, so here's how the open coding analytical grounded theory process was used in the study. First, the researchers audio recorded all interviews with the participants' permission, and then they fully transcribed all interviews for their analysis. And then they highlighted and coded a text segment that met the criteria of providing the best research information, which is those show learners' learning experience with the system, the affordance of the system, and the usefulness for learning. And after that, codes with similar meanings were sorted into categories, and the categories were established to form a framework by which to report findings. Okay, so here's the result. All in all, we can find that using a learning system featuring ITR technology was beneficial to vocabulary acquisition, and that learners who study using ITR technology can have better performance compared to those who using traditional method. So in pretest, there is no significant difference between the 2 groups, but in post-test and delayed post-test, the experimental group has better performance than the control group. Okay. And as for the second research questions, most learners think that ITR technology is satisfactory. So they had high levels of learning satisfaction and have positively perceived their learning experience using ITR technology. Okay. And here are the affordances of the ITR technology. There are 3 main categories of affordances, including technological support, learning, authenticity. Okay, so the subcategories, the code of the categories were shown in this table. Okay, fine. So now let's look at the discussion. The results suggest that EFL vocabulary acquisition was more effective when learners used the system compared to the traditional approach, and the research found that it is useful, meaningful, and relevant to the learner's learning process, and it can make the learners to do active learning. And also they have positive perception of the learning system, and it is easy to use and useful for learning. So an ITR tool may have no limit relates to learning the topic vocabulary, and the learners can learn the words of their interest, which is useful for learning motivation and satisfaction. And also, the learning system was beneficial for the experimental learners to transfer the vocabulary items they learn into their long-term memory. So the retention of this vocabulary in experimental group is better than in the control group. Okay, and here's the using pictures of labels is good for vocabulary learning, and By doing so, it can make the context and learning inseparable. And by using realistic simulation, the learners can learn the vocabulary more effective and meaningful. And finally, additional resources provide ITR provides some additional resources, including the collocation and examples. Okay, so here's the conclusion. First, the learners who study using ITR technology learn vocabulary more easily compared to those who study using the traditional approach. And they positively perceive their learning experience using ITR technology. And finally is the affordance of ITR technology for vocabulary acquisition. Okay, so finally is some of my opinions of this research. The first thing I noticed is that why they choose Russian elementary school students as their participants. Because two learners are in Taiwan and one is in China. So if it seems like a little bit strange for me to take Russian children as their participant. Maybe they should take Chinese or Taiwanese students, but the researcher did not explain why they choose Russian to be their participants. This is something I'm really confused. And the second one is the use of ITR. The researchers wrote something about how to use ITR to prevent the inaccuracy of the technology. But for me, some of the tips of using ITR seems not so essential for me, but maybe that is some essential thing for other readers. And finally, I think the researchers talks about users' familiarity of the tool, which is I agree, because when teaching using some technology tools, if the learners are not familiar with the tool, they may find that the technology is not a help, but more like a burden. So yes, I think this ITR tool is very helpful for students to learn English, and maybe I can apply this ITR tool in my future teaching. But I'm not sure whether this ITR tool does have an app or something, because according to the research procedure, it just looks like the Google function called search by image. So I think this essay can provide us some insights of teaching by using pictures and to teach vocabulary. Okay, so here's the end of my presentation, and thank you.